Hello and welcome to San Sebastian, Spain. I'm David Bolton, and this is a special virtual field trip presented by the California Missions Foundation. Many of the people that came to the missions and presidios in Alta California were descendants from those people that had come originally from Spain. Many parts of Spain were represented in California, including the south, the Andalusia area, the middle, Toledo and Madrid, and here in the north, Basque Country. For the next several minutes, we're going to give you the full story of the California missions. We'll be traveling to several missions that are part of California's chain of 21. We'll introduce you to, and we'll hear from a California Indian as we tour Mission Dolores in San Francisco. We'll talk about why the missions were established, and we'll learn from many of the stories that came out of this important chapter in our history. We'll explain Spain's maritime talents as their ships came to the Americas. We'll also hear how Spain later supported the American Revolution and the independence of the United States. And we'll wrap up this virtual tour answering questions from classrooms like yours. As we continue from Spain, we begin talking about ships and the sea. Spain was one of the strongest world powers at sea during colonial times. Mastering the sea allowed Spain to spread its influences around the world. It was this maritime talent that helped Spain set up missions and presidios throughout the Americas. Christopher Columbus led the first voyage to the Americas, sponsored by Spain, in 1492. 50 years later, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo was the first to sail along the California coast under the Spanish flag. Later, 21 missions and 4 presidios were set up in California. Spanish ships continued to transport people and supplies during California's mission period. Many believe that without support from ships at sea, the Spanish California missions could never have been established. Spain's talents at sea led to more than conquest and evangelization. Here in San Sebastian, Spain, a maritime museum demonstrates how Spain was one of the first countries to sail across the Atlantic in search of whale oil. The Basques of northern Spain were expert whalers, developing large-scale businesses of rich whale oil found off the coast of Canada. Whale oil was used to fuel lamps and lights. It was a key ingredient in soap making, and also Spanish ships used whale oil for waterproofing ropes and treating sails, leading to Spain's sea voyages to the Americas, and eventually, by sea and by land, the establishment of Spain's 21 missions and 4 presidios in California. The Basques from here in northern Spain played a larger role in the California missions and presidios than merely mastering at sea. Many of the most prominent figures in early California were either from the Basque Country or were descendants of those who had come previously from the Basque Country. Among them, Felipe Goycoechea. He was the first comandante at the Santa Barbara Royal Presidio. Fermín Lausuen. He founded 9 of the California missions, including Old Mission Santa Barbara and Mission San Juan Bautista. He was in charge of all of the California missions after Junípero Serra. Felipe de Neve, California's governor, who founded Los Angeles. Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo and his father, Ignacio Vallejo. Mariano helped California transition from Spanish rule to Mexican rule, and ultimately to becoming a part of the United States. And Juan Bautista de Anza. He established the first land route from Mexico to California and brought families to populate San Francisco and other California cities. Spain's involvement in what would become the United States of America stretched beyond the missions and presidios. In California, among other areas, Spain asked all of its citizens residing at the missions and presidios to make a contribution to the Donativo project, the Contribution Project. Spain's King Carlos III used the Donativo funds for several projects that ultimately supported the American Revolution as the U.S. fought for its independence from England. Donativo contributions from Spanish California helped fund, among other efforts, the Siege of Yorktown, which was crucial to the American victory and U.S. independence. July 4th will forever have a historic connection to our Spanish missions and presidios. Even though the California missions are some of the most famous missions anywhere, there were missions outside of California. In fact, there were missions throughout North America and in many parts of the Americas.
For thousands of years, ancient cultures flourished throughout the Americas. These early settlers left us clues to their advanced religions, colorful art, and sophisticated temples. But ways of life that had existed for centuries would soon vanish, becoming distant memories as a new religion and a new culture would soon blanket the Americas. Stretching from present-day Mexico into the U.S. Southwest and Florida, North America's mission trail paved the way for new settlements, a new religion, and new architecture in the New World. These missions of North America are as diverse as their founders, as picturesque as their surrounding countryside, and today, as controversial as the reasons for their establishment. Covering 3 centuries, these missions were constructed with a dual purpose: expand Spain's control in the New World and convert the native inhabitants to the Catholic faith. The mission system brought European ways to the New World nearly a century before the first English colony was established at Jamestown in 1607, and more than 150 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. In fact, the oldest European settlement in the present-day United States, that at St. Augustine, Florida, was founded on behalf of the Spanish Crown in 1565. The founding of St. Augustine led to the first Catholic Mass celebrated on U.S. soil. It was held on the grounds of Mission Nombre de Dios, one of eventually 40 Spanish Catholic missions that would line the Atlantic seaboard from Florida into the Carolinas, and later the Gulf region into Georgia and Alabama. All of the Florida missions, though, disappeared in the early 1700s, as Indians died of disease and early British explorers sought to diminish Spain's influence in the region. In South and Central Florida, European missions never took hold, as the area's strong Calusa native tribe held off all colonial advances for some 300 years. Prior to Spain's discovery of Florida, the seeds of North America's mission trail had been planted on the islands of the Caribbean, Spanish conquistadores landing at what was then called the West Indies, their gateway to the Americas. Names like Cortez, Ponce de Leon, and Núñez de Balboa would become synonymous with the early exploration, ultimately changing, for better or for worse, Native American cultures. For Spanish explorers, there were 2 routes to seize North America's riches. At first, into Florida, and later into Mexico, and finally into the southwestern United States. Originally in search of gold, the first northern explorers ventured to the west through present-day Arizona, and then into New Mexico, while later travels took the Spaniards straight up through Mexico, through El Paso, and to the banks of the Rio Grande. When no wealth was found in the area, the first mission chain of the U.S. Southwest sprang up in New Mexico in the late 1500s. Later explorations brought Catholic missionaries into Texas, Arizona, and Baja California in the 1600s, and finally to Alta California in the 1700s. With the establishment of North America's missions, new architectural styles were introduced into the Americas. Structurally, the missions of North America differ from region to region. To this day, characteristics of mission architecture can be found throughout the U.S. Southwest, with columns, arches, and domes suddenly dominating these great expanses. In Texas, an abundance of limestone helped the settlers build sturdy, fortress-like structures. In bordering New Mexico, the missionaries, using adobe, often built simple shrines that blended with century-old buildings such as those in Taos. In the Sonoran Desert region of southern Arizona, The missions are characterized by ornate detail in a Baroque style. Here, builders also used adobe, brick and stone to create some of the most elaborate structures in North America. On the shores of the Pacific, the 21 missions of Alta California today boast an architectural combination of original ideas with turn-of-the-century renovation. Adobe was the material of choice in Alta California, while stone churches are widely found throughout Baja California. The commonly accepted belief is that the missions were largely constructed by the native populations under the direction of their European overseers. The missions of Spanish North America became more than religious centers where the Catholic faith was spread. Most missions, built in the shape of a quadrangle, offered an all-inclusive complex for worship, education, and community functions. The mission complex soon became the focus of the community, a place where work was done, classes were taught, and where social gatherings took place. Today, many North American cities carry the same name of the missions they sprouted from. Notably in California, ranging from urban centers such as San Francisco and San Diego, to less populous cities like Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo, to small communities such as San Juan Bautista and Soledad. At first, the missionaries drew the natives to their missions using food and other gifts. Once there, missionaries taught their converts with symbols, many diagrams like these musical guides at California's San Antonio de Padua are painted on the mission walls. Although they were sent for religious purposes, the missionaries of North America are also credited with bringing new agriculture to the area, as well as elaborate irrigation systems to service the new crops. In addition, the Spaniards introduced the horse to the New World, an animal along with cattle that would become the foundation of transportation, commerce, and farming for hundreds of years. Fruits, vegetables, and a variety of plants now considered common items can also be traced to the missionaries, among them grapes, date palms, citrus, and wheat. The old and new crops and European livestock helped the missionaries to be self-sufficient. And to bring water to their mission complex, an extensive water system was often constructed. Aqueducts like this engineering marvel in Querétaro, Mexico, transported water for miles to the mission grounds. Complex dams like this one at Mission Santa Barbara and water ditches like those found in San Antonio would then store this most valuable of resources. Serra and all padres were Catholic, and 4 separate Catholic religious orders oversaw these missions, spreading the new faith among North America's native people. Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinians combined to change the religious landscape of North America. Their quest with the cross met many barriers, especially a language barrier. Numerous linguistic and cultural differences among the natives made the Spanish conquest extremely difficult, and in virtually all areas, the natives resisted the European intruders at one time or another. Uprisings sprang up at several of the missions. At California Santa Ynez, the Chumash natives rebelled, storming the mission and forcing the missionaries to take refuge inside. Over the years, some missionaries were killed in native uprisings. Among those martyred, Father Luis Jaime at Mission San Diego. But the same fate would meet nearly all of the natives, from the Puebloans in New Mexico to the Pima in Arizona, from the Chumash in California to the Coahuiltecans in Texas. Diseases devastated the native population. The Native Americans' immune systems could not protect them from diseases brought by the Europeans. After 300 years of triumphs and catastrophes, North America's mission trail would end here in 1832 at one of the last missions built, Mission San Francisco Solano in Sonoma, California. The missions fell into ruin as Mexico won its independence from Spain, and priorities shifted to the new burdens of managing the new republic. It was not until the 20th century that conservation efforts would restore many of these missions to their original splendor, bringing back important pieces of North American history.
The first mission in California was that at Mission San Diego, established in 1769. Our next trip is going to be to San Diego, where we speak with Janet Bartel.
For thousands of years, the American Indians lived in this area that we now know as the state of California. You know, that 10,000 years is how long they have measured back that the Kumeyaay people have lived in this area.
All of the maps showed California to be an island before the 1700s. So Spain, when they were exploring this part of the world, they saw no reason to make settlements here. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo landed here in 1542. He named the area San Miguel after the saint whose feast day was closest to the landing, because that was the Spanish tradition. Nothing happened to the area until around 1602. Vizcaino, again sailing for Spain, he landed here. He looked around at the area. He thought it was an island, but he renamed it San Diego after Saint Didacus of Alcalá, Spain. Finally, King Carlos III of Spain became concerned. Spain had what we call the right of discovery because they had stopped here and named them. But unless they made settlements, it was going to be open to Russia, France, England, whoever wanted it. So King Carlos III of Spain sent word to New Spain, which is what we now refer to as Mexico, go claim Alta California for Spain. He wanted it to look religious. So he chose Father Junipero Serra, who was in charge of the Baja missions at that time, to lead the sacred expedition to establish what we now know as the state of California.
2 different ships and 2 different land parties came to California to establish the first mission and to establish the Spanish presence.
They all arrived here by the end of June 1769. The first mission, San Diego, was established on what we now know as the Presidio. Father Junipero Serra was born in Petra de Mallorca in 1713. He was born to a very poor farming family. His lifelong dream was to become a Franciscan, but he was very sickly as a child. He was small, he was wiry, and the Franciscans are mendicant orders. It's not easy being a Franciscan, but he was more determined and probably pesty to them than anything else, so they finally admitted him into the Franciscan order. He became very learned. He even had a doctorate in theology. He was extremely charismatic. People would come from miles around just to listen to him talk. His other lifelong dream was to bring Christianity to what they considered the New World. So when he was 36 years old in 1749, he sailed to the New World. He landed in New Spain, and then he was eventually assigned to the Baja missions. So when he was chosen to lead the expeditions up here, he was thrilled he could bring Christianity to a part of the world that was untouched by Christianity. When Father Serra arrived, I believe it was June 29, 1769, the men who had arrived first had sort of reconnoitered the area and chose the site for the first mission, which was what we now refer to as Presidio Hill.
For military reasons, they placed the first Presidio, the fort, up on top of the hill, overlooking the village, overlooking the bay.
July 16th, 1769, he put a cross in the ground, hung a bell somehow, said Mass, and declared the first mission of San Diego de Alcalá.
They had their buildings for the priests. They had a blacksmith here. They developed into the beginnings of a settlement. In that course of development, again, the priests were becoming, they were developing better relationships. They were learning their language. They were learning their ways. The natives were showing them, how to do the things that they would do to survive. Like acorns. Acorns, in their natural state are toxic. They're poisonous. So the natives had a way on how to cure acorns so that they're edible. They were showing them how to survive in an area that they were not accustomed to. At the same time, the priests wanted, being industrious, they were from a part of Spain that was civilized, and they knew that the only way they could survive was if they started planting crops, managing crops. With just one priest and whoever else was there, they needed the help of the local natives, and that's what they started to do. Is they started to bring in the natives and teaching them how to first plow and do all those things so they could manage large plots of land to grow the necessary foods that were that they were accustomed to. The Spanish were accustomed to. San Diego at this time, it's a virtual paradise, and that is what Junipero Serra wrote about. He wrote about when he came north from Mexico that he found the natives to be very slothful. He found them to be a people that ran around with no clothes. They lived in a virtual paradise, which meant that they didn't have to forage for food. They forage as far as for a daily food, but to plan for winter, they didn't have to do that because all that was available even during the winter time. What they did is they recognized those areas that held the acorns, that held the berries, that held all those foods of subsistence. But as far as manage, no, they didn't manage other than to care for the areas of where they were harvesting their food. As they came to see the friars, the priests, and they saw that they were a peaceful people, there's always those few that trust before others, and I believe that's what they did. Is those that trusted started to visit, and when they started to visit, they started to interact, and when they started to interact, they developed a relationship, where finally they wanted what they had. They wanted to be a part of who they were.
And now it's time for us to introduce you to a real California Indian. And to meet him, let's go to Mission San Francisco de Asís, commonly called Mission Dolores.
Welcome to Old Mission Dolores, San Francisco. My name is Andy Galvin, but my friends, they call me many things, and I happen to be the curator here. But that may not be a fourth grade vocabulary word, so I tell people I'm the museum director. Do you understand that better? Okay. When we go in, we're going to go in our entrance right here. We're going to go inside the church, just on the other side of this wall. We're going to aim at a spiral staircases there. We're not going to go up the staircase, but I want to have everybody gather over there. So adults, help us by organizing the students to turn and face me. I'll give you direction when we get inside, okay? For years and years, I went to school and I learned all about history and museums, but I know the real reason they hired me is not because I got academic degrees, but because I have a degree in blood. And my degree in blood is related very much to this building when it was 3 years old. Remember I said it was completed in 1791? So in 1794, through the door entrance right here to my side, my great-great-great-great-grandfather walked through that entrance. He wasn't from Mexico or Spain. He wasn't from any country of Europe. He wasn't from Asia or Africa, but he was across the San Francisco Bay in a town today we call Walnut Creek, California. He's a Bay Miwok Indian. Here at Mission Dolores, we have bells. And those ropes behind me are connected to our bells. Our bells arrived from Mexico in the year 1794. So they don't sound as good as if they were new. But do you know where the San Francisco Presidio is? Where the Golden Gate Bridge Toll Plaza is? That's 4 miles from here. And during the mission days, you could hear these bells all the way to the Presidio, because the Indians who lived here would go work at the Presidio. And the way they knew it was time to come home at the end of the day, they would hear our bells. Now that you're seated, I want to remind you, you are seated in the oldest standing intact adobe building in the modern state of California. Did you notice all those adjectives? One, modern state. So what's the old state of California? California as a state is the year 1850. That's only 175 years ago. Before California, there weren't any adobe brick. Well, do you know what an adobe brick is? Yes. Who can tell me what an adobe brick is? Yes.
It's like a brick made out of mud that the Native Americans put into molds, I think.
Very good. It's a brick made out of mud. What else goes into that mud? What's the recipe for an adobe brick? What do you put in it? Yes?
Wheat.
Wheat, straw. Okay, straw, grass. Okay. Yes? Dirt. Cow poop. Yes, cow patties we call them. And water. And you make a mold out of wood and you pour that in and then you bake them out in the sunlight. Our adobe bricks in this room, there are 36,000 adobe bricks. Each one of them weighs about 40 pounds. They are 22 inches long, 11 inches wide, and about 4 inches thick. And they're laid all up here to build this building. But the floor tiles are cooked in an oven, a kiln, and that way they can get wet, because if the adobe bricks get wet, they will return to dirt. And that's why you see the whitewash on the walls, because there is lime in that paint mix to protect the walls. Now, if you look up at the ceiling, right there where you are, bend your neck, and you will see the largest artifact in the room. That's our ceiling. Because if you look up at it, it's the only big piece in this room that does not look European or does not look very Christian. The ceiling that you're looking at, that is not European or Mexican. It is Native American traditional artwork, especially the zigzag pattern that you see on the beams. That's what the art people call chevron. Now, if you were knitting, you know, when you take those two little long things and you start knitting, that's the pattern that shows up easiest. It's the zigzag pattern, okay? But that was the pattern that the Indian women here wove in their baskets. These mission buildings, especially the churches, could only be as wide as that many trees you could find in the area. So each one of those beams is a redwood tree. A mission is a place that you've been studying where the missionaries would take the people in these lands and turn them into Christians. The missionaries came to California to change the Indians into Christians. But that wasn't the only thing the missionaries were going to help change, okay? The missionaries' job was to change the Indian into a good Spaniard. And at that time, in 1797, when the missionaries were here, that's when my ancestors are here, there was only one kind of a good Spaniard, and that was a Christian Spaniard. So the goal of the missionary was to change the Indian. Now remember I told you about my ancestor, my great-great-great-great-grandfather. He came here in the year 1794. The record books say he's about 30 years old when he gets here. And the first thing that happens to him, the day he arrives in 1794, the record books say he is baptized a Christian. The big back wall with all the statues and that arrives from Mexico in the year 1797. So my great-great-great-grandfather was here when that back wall was put up. It came up in crates from Mexico on a ship. Have you ever worked with Legos? Yeah. Okay. So when it was uncrated from the ship, they had to put it together like putting together Legos. All the statues came in boxes, all these statues. Follow me this way, please. It's a very special place, but there's something about this cemetery here in San Francisco. There are only 2 cemeteries today in San Francisco. This one, and then the one at the Army, the Presidio Cemetery. In the year 1900, there used to be 14 cemeteries in San Francisco, but San Francisco ran out of land to build new houses and buildings. The grave marker here is my ancestors who were here at the mission during the mission period, okay? They lived in houses like we're looking at before they came to the mission. This is a Tule reed grass house. The Tule reeds grow all over in the marshlands here. There weren't any buffalo here in California, so we don't have those big hides. There would have been an animal skin over the door though, but it would have been probably a deer, 2 deer skins sewn together. The grasses here were used to make buildings like this, to make Tule boats, to make baskets. We even made sandals and sun visors. You saw them in the museum, okay? Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Miss Fong. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Now it's time for us to answer questions from classrooms like yours throughout the state. Our first question comes from Hirsch Elementary in Fremont, California. Do all the missions have a cemetery? And what is the biggest preservation challenge when it comes to graves? For the answer, we welcome Lee Panich.
So yes, all of the 21 California missions do have a cemetery on their grounds, and in some cases, multiple cemeteries. So the school that asked this question is in Fremont, so we can use the example of Mission San Jose, which is in Fremont, California. There are 2 cemeteries. There's one directly adjacent to the mission church, and over time, that cemetery filled, and they decided to move the cemetery about a mile away from where the mission is. And so that mission, for instance, has 2 different cemeteries. Sometimes they moved the cemetery closer when it filled, or in some cases, like here at Santa Clara, the mission actually moved, and so we have 2 cemeteries on our campus. And yes, preservation is an important issue at the California missions, particularly with the cemeteries, and that's because over time, particularly if the cemeteries were moved, people lost knowledge of where those cemeteries were. And so in some cases, agricultural fields have encroached on them. In other cases, development has taken place. And in the case of Fremont, for example, the Highway 680 was originally planned to go over the second, more recent cemetery, which is today renamed as the Ohlone Indian Cemetery. And so it's a really important thing at all the mission sites that these cemeteries be preserved, and the local parishes, Native American groups, and other descendants of those who are whose relatives are in the cemeteries are working really hard to preserve those sacred grounds.
Our next question comes from Alpine Elementary in Little Rock, California. How were the missions different? For the answer, we welcome Michael Imoli.
Missions were different because of many reasons. The 3 main reasons are the people, the location, and the availability of natural resources. Missions were communities established for local Indians, which varied throughout the state. There was, for example, the Kumeyaay to the south in the San Diego area, the Tonga and Chumash on the central coast, and the Ohlone to the north. So each mission community was made up by a different population and a different group of Indians, all of which had different languages or dialects of languages. The location was also important because the location for a mission was also often chosen where there was already a large mission or Indian community. And the other factor that made the missions different is their proximity to natural resources. Natural resources like grass for grazing cattle and sheep, water, which they needed for building and irrigating crops, and other kinds of resources like clay for making tile and stone for building foundations.
Our next question comes from Acacia Magnet School for Enriched Learning, Thousand Oaks, California. Why is it important for us to learn about the California missions? For the answer, we welcome Damian Bosich.
There are a lot of reasons why it's important to learn about the mission system or about the missions in general. First of all, the missions are super important for our history here in California. By learning about the missions, we can learn about art, history, architecture, and even agriculture and farming, because, in fact, the missions were the first farms in California. And so missions are not only buildings, but they were big farms. They were places where people lived. They have interesting buildings and art in them. And of course, when you learn about the missions, you also learn about the first people of California, the Native Americans, right? You learn about them and their lives and the people who came later, people who migrated north from what is today Mexico, and other people who came and were involved in the mission system. And in fact, a lot of important historical events took place in and around the missions, and some very important firsts. So, for example, did you know that California's first hospital was at a mission? Mission San Rafael in north of San Francisco Bay was made first as a hospital to care for the native people who got sick at the mission in San Francisco, Mission Dolores. And for example, did you know that a pirate attacked the missions? In 1818, a pirate named Hippolyte Bouchard came down the coast and attacked several missions there. So there were actually pirates on the coast of California, and you learn that by learning about the missions. Or did you know that California's first libraries were actually at the missions? The Padres who ran the missions had their own libraries, and you can go visit them today. And most of the missions actually had orchestras that played music, and that music was played and sung by the Native American people who lived at the missions. So these are all some interesting facts about the missions that you learn by studying them. And by learning about the missions, we also learn about the place we live. So many of the places in California got their names from missions. San Francisco, San Diego, the San Fernando Valleys, named after the San Fernando Mission, the city of San Gabriel, San Juan Capistrano, all these places were named because of the missions. Another reason learning about the missions is important is you can learn how people used resources back 200 years ago. How did people use water? Because the missions needed water. How did they bring water to the missions? How did people use timber, wood for building things? How did they use stone for building things? How did they use the soil for growing things? All these issues that we still deal with in California, we can learn from studying the missions. And on top of it, and this is very interesting, we learn how California is connected to Mexico and to Spain, how we share a common culture with them, right? Many people in California speak Spanish. Many people in California immigrated from Mexico, or their families came from Mexico or Latin America. And that was the case with the missions 200 years ago and the people that came afterward. So there is a lot for us to learn by studying the missions and the mission system.
Our next question is from Virtual Academy in San Bernardino. How did the gold rush affect the California missions? Lee Panich has the answer.
So this is a really good question. Most of the California missions were secularized in 1834. Some of them continued to operate until 1836. And so what that meant is by the time of the gold rush in 1848, 49, most of the missions were no longer operating as they had been earlier in the colonial period. Now, that doesn't mean that they were abandoned. In most cases, The Franciscans and other Catholic clergy were still around the missions during the gold rush, and in almost all cases, Native Americans were as well. And so the gold rush had a big effect on the missions, which again, by that point, were starting to change from the big mission estates that they had been into more like parish churches that we would know today. And so in some cases, Native people who were still around the missions decided to leave during the gold rush and go seek their fortune in the gold fields. That was pretty common. And at the same time, newcomers to California who came to our state for the gold rush found that the missions in many locations were really the only substantial buildings in particular areas. So the missions had the agricultural infrastructure, they had adobe buildings with roofs and things like that. And so they were really attractive for newcomers, particularly in cases where people had left to, where the Native Americans had left to go to the goldfields themselves, or the missions had lost populations for other reasons. And so, for instance, where I am at Santa Clara, the mission was kind of overrun by newcomers during the gold rush. And the same is true at many other California missions throughout the region. At San Jose, for instance, the mission became a major stopping point for newcomers to San Francisco Bay that then got supplies there and headed out to the Sierra to seek their fortune. Now, for the missions, this was not a great thing because there's lots of testimony from the time period that the newcomers were just kind of setting themselves up in the building, sometimes damaging the building, and sometimes even damaging the, for instance, at San Jose, the musical instruments that they had there and other things. And so it was kind of a mixed bag for the missions because they were already starting to be in decline, and the folks who came for the gold rush sometimes accelerated that.
Our next question comes from Competitive Edge Charter Academy in Yucaipa, California. What was it like to build a mission? What tools and materials were used? And what were the jobs? Archaeologist Mike Imwally has the answer.
It was different at each mission depending on the availability of resources. Water was a really important need, so if they didn't establish the mission at a place where there's water readily available on a permanent basis, they had to immediately invest in building a water system that would bring water to the mission from a permanent source. Other resources that they needed that affected where they were located and how they were built was the ability of clay for making tiles and making bricks. They needed mud for making adobe bricks. They needed stone for foundations, or in the cases of some missions, actual stone walls. And they needed lime for making whitewash to protect the walls and mortar to lay stone and tile. The tools they would have used are a lot like the tools we use today. They would have been fashioned a lot more crudely, but they would have used picks and hoes and shovels and wheelbarrows for making tile and for making adobe bricks, for making mortar. They would have also used axes, saws, and adzes for doing carpentry, for making doors and door frames, windows and wood window frames, and the roof frames on the adobe and stone walls. Another tool that they used was a kiln, and they had several types of kilns, one for processing lime, which they needed for mortar, and another kiln, a different type of kiln, was used for firing clay roof tiles and floor tiles. The jobs kind of go with the tools. You had brick makers who mixed clay or mud for adobe and in a pit and then transported it to molds in wheelbarrows, and then they lifted those molds off. And then their job was to rotate those bricks as they dried and then load them back into wheelbarrows and transport them to wherever the building was going on. There were masons who laid tile and laid the adobe bricks. There were tile makers who formed the clay roof tiles and floor tiles and then fired them in kilns. And then there were carpenters who took timber that was brought to the mission, formed them into beams and planks, and made roofs and doors and windows. That's a small tip of the iceberg, but those are the main jobs.
Our final question comes from Planada Elementary in Planada, California. Are all of the missions open to the public? Damian Basic has the answer.
So there are 21 missions, as you know, in California, and most of them are churches, right? So they are active places of worship where people come on Sundays and other days to pray and to celebrate religious holidays. So they're open, and there are two of them that are state parks. So Mission San Francisco Solano, up north of San Francisco, in Sonoma, is actually not a church anymore. It's run by the California State Parks, so you can go visit it. And also Mission La Purísima down near Solvang is also a state park. And all of those, the state parks and the other ones, are open almost all year, almost every day. And each of the missions has a museum. So you can go and not only go in the mission church, which is probably the most important place to go, but you can also go inside the museum where you'll see lots of different artworks and artifacts about the mission. And you can also tour the grounds. Oftentimes, if you go there, you can get a tour where a guide will take you and tell you all about the missions, which you may have done already. But all 21 of the missions are open and you can visit them all. And I hope you do. I've been to all of them, and I think you should ask your parents and teachers to take you to all of them as well.
Some very interesting questions, and we thank all of the schools that contribute to this question and answer session. That's going to do it for this special virtual tour presented by the California Missions Foundation from San Sebastian, Spain. I'm David Bolton, and we hope that you learned more today about the California Missions and Presidios.